The fluorescent lights of the Pulaski County Courthouse hallway hummed a monotonous tune, their sterile glow reflecting off the polished linoleum floor. Brent Mallaloy strode down the hall, his footsteps echoing in the unsettling quiet. He adjusted his tie, a nervous tic he hadn't been aware of until this morning. The weight of the impending hearing pressed down on him like a physical burden, a dull ache in his chest. He tried to shrug it off, telling himself it was just another bureaucratic hurdle, a minor inconvenience. He'd faced internal investigations before. This one, he thought, would be no different. He'd handled worse. He'd seen worse. A flicker of a memory, a young woman's terrified eyes, crossed his mind. He pushed it away. He had done what he had to do. He had maintained order. Hadn't he? The air in the hallway felt thick, stagnant, like the breath held before a plunge into icy water. He could smell the faint scent of disinfectant, the metallic tang of fear clinging to the air. He recognized it, the same scent that permeated the holding cells, the interrogation rooms. He'd always found it strangely comforting, a scent of control of his domain. Today, however, it felt different, suffocating. The hallway seemed to stretch endlessly, the doors lining it like identical, unblinking eyes. Each door represented a life altered, a judgment passed. He wondered briefly about the stories behind those doors, the lives hanging in the balance within those rooms. He scoffed inwardly. Sentimentality wouldn't serve him today. He needed to be sharp, focused. He needed to convince the panel he was still the officer they'd known for years, the one they'd commended for his unwavering dedication, his commitment to upholding the law, the man he once believed himself to be. He reached courtroom 4B. The double doors, imposing and dark, loomed before him. He hesitated, his hand hovering over the brass handle. A strange premonition washed over him, a sense of unease he couldn't quite place. He took a deep breath, steeling himself, and pushed the door open. The courtroom was hushed, the air thick with anticipation. Rows of wooden benches faced the judge's bench, a few occupied by journalists scribbling in their notepads, their pens scratching against the paper like tiny insects. Mallaloy scanned the room, his gaze sweeping over the faces of the attendees. He met the eyes of Malik Harmon, the teenage boy who'd filed the complaint, finally exacting her revenge. But now, facing him, the imagined triumph felt hollow. The years had eroded the sharp edges of her anger, leaving behind a dull ache of weariness. This wasn't about revenge, she reminded herself. This was about justice, about upholding the law, the very law he had so blatantly disregarded. She took a deep breath, forcing her emotions back under control. Her face remained impassive, a mask of judicial neutrality. Inside, however, a storm raged. The memories of that day, vivid and visceral, threatened to overwhelm her. The jeers of the crowd, the cold steel of the clippers against her scalp, the feeling of utter powerlessness. She could almost feel the phantom weight of her long hair, the way it used to fall around her shoulders like a protective cloak. She pushed the memories away, focusing on the task at hand. She was a judge now, not a victim. Her personal feelings were irrelevant. She had to be impartial, objective. She had to uphold the law, even for the man who had so cruelly violated it. Mallaloy stood before her, his initial bravado crumbling under the weight of her gaze. He had expected anger, perhaps even a flicker of recognition in her eyes. Instead, he saw only an impenetrable wall of composure, a chilling indifference that unnerved him more than any outburst of rage could have. He felt a knot tighten in his stomach. This wasn't how it was supposed to be. He had imagined a different scenario, one where he could explain, justify his actions. He had convinced himself that he had been following orders, maintaining order in a chaotic situation. But now, facing the woman he had wronged, the carefully constructed justifications dissolved like smoke. He saw not just a judge, but the young woman he had stripped of her dignity, the woman whose life he had irrevocably altered. He saw the ghost of her long, dark hair falling to the floor, the fear in her eyes mirroring his own growing terror. He swallowed hard, his throat suddenly dry. He had underestimated her. He had underestimated the strength it took to rebuild a life shattered by his actions, the resilience it took to transform from victim to the very embodiment of justice. He had underestimated the power of a woman scorned, not in the fiery, vengeful way he had anticipated, but in the quiet, unwavering strength that radiated from her now, a strength that threatened to crush him beneath its weight. He felt a tremor run through him, a premonition of the reckoning to come. The hearing hadn't even begun, and yet he already felt condemned. The air in courtroom for be hung thick and still, heavy with unspoken history. Sunlight, fractured by the blinds, cast long, sharp lines across the polished wooden floor, a silent grid upon which the drama would unfold. Janelle Riggins, her black robe a stark contrast against the pale wood, adjusted the microphone almost imperceptibly. Her fingers, long and slender, moved with a practiced grace that belied the turmoil churning within. 10 years, she thought, the words echoing in the vast chambers of her mind. 10 years, and the ghost of that day still lingers. She could almost feel the phantom weight of rough hands on her scalp, the cold metal of the shears against her skin. She pushed the memory down, burying it beneath layers of judicial composure. This wasn't about her. This was about justice. Brent Mallaloy stood before her, a stiff, unyielding figure in a dark blue uniform. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, a subtle tremor in his stance betraying a nervousness he desperately tried to conceal. Janelle observed him, her gaze steady and unwavering. He avoided her eyes, his gaze darting around the room, clinging to the indifferent faces in the gallery, the stoic lines of the court reporter's back, anything but the woman who held his fate in her hands. He'd aged, she noted, the lines around his eyes deeper, his jaw tighter. Time had etched its passage on his face, but the arrogance in his posture remained. He still carried himself with the same swagger, the same air of entitlement that had fueled his actions a decade ago. Mr. Mallaloy, Janelle's voice, amplified by the microphone, cut through the silence. It was cool and even devoid of any trace of emotion. Inside, however, a storm raged. Don't let him see, she commanded herself. Don't give him the satisfaction. Take a seat. The words, simple yet commanding, hung in the air. For a moment, Mallaloy hesitated, a flicker of defiance crossing his face. He opened his mouth as if to speak, then closed it again, the unspoken words caught in his throat. The weight of the room, the weight of the past, seemed to press down on him. He finally sat, the movement stiff and awkward. Janelle allowed a fraction of a second to pass, the silence stretching, taut and heavy. It amplified the subtle shift in power, the unspoken acknowledgement of her authority. Today's hearing, she began, her voice resonating with practiced clarity, concerns multiple allegations of misconduct dating back 5 years. She paused, letting her gaze sweep over the courtroom, taking in the faces of the jury, the lawyers, the witnesses. She saw Malik Harmon, a young man barely out of his teens, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and determination. Beside him sat Sandra Wells, her face etched with weariness, but her spine straight, her gaze unwavering. Their presence, their silent testimony, strengthened Janelle's resolve. This is for them, she thought. This is for all those who suffered in silence. Officer Mallaloy, she continued, her voice taking on a sharper edge. You stand accused of using excessive force, of violating the rights of citizens, of abusing the power entrusted to you. Each word was a precise strike, a deliberate blow against the wall of indifference he had built around himself. She could almost hear the cracks forming, the subtle crumbling of his carefully constructed facade. Mallaloy's hands tightened into fists beneath the table. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously. She's enjoying this, he thought, his stomach twisting into a knot. She's relishing every moment. He'd expected anger, perhaps even a hint of vengeance. But this cold, detached demeanor was far more unsettling. It was the calmness of a predator, the measured control of someone who held all the cards. He'd underestimated her. He'd underestimated the quiet strength forged in the crucible of humiliation. We're here for facts, Janelle continued, her voice echoing through the silent courtroom. Truth, accountability. The words, simple yet profound, resonated with the weight of unspoken history. They were a reminder of the principles she upheld, the values she held dear. They were also a stark contrast to the chaos and injustice of that day 10 years ago, when those very principles had been trampled underfoot. Janelle took a deep breath, steadying herself. She allowed herself a fleeting glance at Mallaloy, her gaze meeting his for the briefest of moments. In his eyes, she saw a flicker of something akin to fear. It was a small victory, a subtle shift in the balance of power. This isn't about revenge, she reminded herself. This is about justice. The distinction was crucial. It was the line that separated her from him, the line that defined her integrity. She looked back at the court, her face impassive, her voice unwavering. Let the proceedings begin. The sun beat down on MacArthur Park, turning the air thick and heavy. The asphalt shimmered, radiating heat that climbed up Janelle's legs, clinging to her jeans like a second skin. 19 years old, heart pounding a rhythm of idealism against her ribs, she gripped her hand-painted sign. Protect, not punish. The words, stark black against the white cardboard, seemed to vibrate in the oppressive humidity. Sweat trickled down her temple, stinging her eyes, blurring the edges of the crowd. Around her, a sea of faces, young and old, reflected a shared anger, a shared grief. They were here for Demetrius, a name, a life extinguished too soon. Another hashtag, another victim, another reason to demand accountability. Janelle shifted her weight, the discomfort in her legs a dull ache compared to the knot in her stomach. Doubt, a cold finger, traced a path down her spine. Was this really making a difference? Would anyone listen? She glanced at Mrs. Jefferson, her history teacher, standing a few feet away, a quiet pillar of strength. Seeing the older woman's resolute expression, Janelle felt a surge of conviction. Someone has to speak. Someone has to fight. A ripple of unease spread through the crowd. The low hum of conversation quieted. From the edge of the park, a line of police officers advanced, their uniforms dark against the sun-drenched grass. The glint of metal badges, batons caught the light. Janelle's breath hitched. A tremor of fear, sharp and cold, shot through her. They looked different, not like the officers who occasionally patrolled her neighborhood, offering a friendly nod. These men wore an air of hardened indifference, their faces impassive behind mirrored sunglasses. The rhythmic thud of their boots on the pavement pulsed like a warning drum. A megaphone crackled to life, a disembodied voice cutting through the air. This is an unlawful assembly. You are ordered to disperse. The voice, amplified and distorted, lacked any trace of human warmth. It was a command, not a request. A collective murmur rose from the crowd, a wave of indignation. We have a right to be here, someone shouted. Justice for Demetrius, another voice cried. Janelle's heart hammered against her ribs. The knot in her stomach tightened. She wanted to run, to melt away into the anonymity of the crowd. But her feet felt rooted to the spot, anchored by a stubborn defiance. She clutched her sign tighter, the cardboard digging into her fingers. This was important. Demetrius mattered. The line of officers continued to advance, their movements deliberate, menacing. The air crackled with tension, thick and suffocating like the heat. The megaphone blared again, the order to disperse repeating like a broken record. Suddenly, the first line of protesters surged forward, a desperate attempt to hold their ground. A shove, a shout, and then chaos. The police waded into the crowd, batons swinging. Screams erupted, mingling with the dull thud of blows. The scene, once vibrant with purpose, dissolved into a swirling vortex of violence. Janelle's mind raced. This wasn't supposed to happen. This was a peaceful protest. She stumbled back, trying to find her footing in the sudden pandemonium. A hand, rough and unforgiving, clamped down on her arm. She cried out, twisting around to see a face contorted in anger. Officer Brent Mallaloy. His eyes, cold and hard, bored into hers. You were told to disperse, he growled, his voice tight with barely contained fury. The grip on her arm tightened, cutting off her circulation. I'm not resisting, Janelle gasped, the words choked by fear. Her sign slipped from her numb fingers, falling to the ground, trampled underfoot. Mallaloy sneered, his lip curling in disdain. Resisting arrest, he barked, yanking her forward with brutal force. Janelle's head snapped back, the world a blur of motion and sound. She caught a glimpse of Mrs. Jefferson, her face etched with horror, reaching out a helpless hand. Then, everything went dark. The last thing she heard was the insistent drone of the megaphone, the distorted voice echoing the hollow words, "Disperse, disperse." The metallic taste of fear coated her tongue, a bitter prelude to the humiliation that was to come. Her thoughts, once sharp and focused, scattered like leaves in a storm. Demetrius, justice, protect, not punish. The words, now meaningless, faded into the roaring chaos. The holding cell reeked of stale sweat and despair. Janelle huddled on the cold concrete floor, the rough texture biting into her skin. Each shallow breath hitched in her chest, a strangled bird against the cage of her ribs. The air, thick with the murmur of other detainees, pressed down on her, a physical manifestation of the fear coiling in her gut. Just breathe, she told herself, just breathe. But the mantra offered little comfort. The metallic tang of fear clung to the back of her throat. She could still feel the phantom pressure of the officer's hand on her arm, the rough shove that had landed her here. It hadn't been violent, not exactly, but the casual disregard for her personhood had been a violence all its own. She closed her eyes, trying to conjure the righteous anger that had fueled her only hours before, the conviction that had propelled her into the heart of the protest. Now, all that remained was a chilling premonition, a sense of unease that gnawed at the edges of her resolve. A clang echoed down the corridor, the sound of metal against metal, grating against her already frayed nerves. Footsteps approached, heavy and deliberate, each one a hammer blow against the silence in her mind. The key grated in the lock, the door creaked open, and a figure silhouetted against the dim hallway light filled the doorway. It was him, Officer Mallaloy. His face, etched with a dismissive indifference, was all too familiar from the news reports, from the whispered warnings amongst her fellow activists. This is it, a voice whispered in the back of her mind. This is what they do to us. She swallowed hard, the metallic taste of fear intensifying. Riggins, Janelle, he said, his voice flat, devoid of any inflection. He didn't look at her, his gaze fixed on some point beyond her shoulder. The casual dismissal, the way he reduced her to a name on a file, ignited a flicker of defiance in her chest. She lifted her chin, meeting his gaze with a steady stare. It was a small act of rebellion, a desperate attempt to reclaim some semblance of control. But even as she did so, a tremor of fear ran through her. He gestured towards the open door with a jerk of his head. Let's go. Magistrates waiting. The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken threat. She knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that whatever awaited her was far worse than this cramped, fetid cell. The makeshift courtroom was a mockery of justice. A bare, concrete room, furnished with a single folding table and a few mismatched chairs. The air was thick with the smell of dust and disinfectant, a sterile scent that did nothing to mask the underlying stench of corruption. A man in a rumpled suit sat behind the table, his face etched with boredom. He barely glanced at her as she was ushered in. The proceedings, if they could even be called that, were swift and perfunctory. The charges were read, a litany of offenses she barely registered. Resistance, disorderly conduct, disturbing the peace. The words echoed in the small room, hollow and meaningless. She knew with a sickening certainty that none of it mattered. This wasn't about justice, it was about control. It was about making an example. Mallaloy stood beside her, his presence a suffocating weight. She could feel his gaze on her, a palpable pressure that made her skin crawl. He leaned in, his voice a low murmur against her ear. Don't make this harder, he said, the words laced with a veiled threat. She closed her eyes, fighting back the wave of nausea that threatened to overwhelm her. Don't give him the satisfaction, she told herself. Don't let him see your fear. She felt a hand on her shoulder, rough and insistent. She was pushed down into a chair, her head forced forward. The cold metal of clippers grazed her scalp, the sensation sending a shiver down her spine. The hum of the clippers filled the room, a mechanical drone that seemed to amplify the silence in her mind. She could feel the hair falling away, strands of it brushing against her cheek, a physical manifestation of her humiliation. This is happening. A voice screamed inside her head. This is real. The weight of his gaze intensified, a predatory presence that seemed to bore into her very soul. She could feel the heat rising in her cheeks, the shame burning through her like acid. She wanted to scream, to fight back, to do anything to break free from this nightmare. But she remained still, her body rigid with a forced composure. It was a small act of defiance, a desperate attempt to retain some semblance of dignity in the face of this utter degradation. Each snip of the clippers was a blow to her pride, a chipping away at her sense of self. But beneath the humiliation, a different emotion began to take root. Not anger, not rage, but something colder, harder. A steely resolve that whispered in the depths of her being, I will not forget this. I will never forget. The faint hum of the refrigerator was the only sound that dared intrude on the suffocating silence of her dorm room. Janelle sat hunched over her desk, the cheap particle board digging into her forearms. A small pool of lamplight illuminating the notebook open before her. The pen trembled in her hand, hovering above the blank page like a hesitant bird. Months had passed, yet the raw wound of that day festered, throbbing with a dull, persistent ache. She could still feel the phantom weight of hands on her scalp, the cold metal of the clippers against her skin, the jeers of the crowd echoing in the hollow spaces of her memory. Shame, a suffocating blanket, threatened to smother her. She closed her eyes, her breath hitching in her throat, a wave of nausea rising from the pit of her stomach. Why now? Why is it hitting me so hard now? She wondered, the question reverberating in the silence of her mind. It had been a numb sort of pain until this moment, a detached horror she could almost pretend wasn't real. But tonight the dam had broken. The memories, once blurry and distant, now surged forward, sharp and vivid, each detail etched into her mind with agonizing clarity. The smell of stale coffee and sweat from the makeshift courtroom, the glint of triumph in Mallaloy's eyes, the way her own hair felt, strangely heavy, in his grasp before it fell to the floor, a dark, lifeless cascade. Opening her eyes, she focused on the blank page, a vast, intimidating expanse of white. It seemed to mock her, daring her to spill the poison that churned within her. She gripped the pen tighter, her knuckles whitening. Where to begin? How could she possibly translate the chaotic storm inside her into mere words? The first stroke of the pen was hesitant, shaky, a fragile line against the stark white. But as she began to write, a strange sense of calm began to settle over her. It was as if, by transferring the memories onto paper, she was somehow exorcising them from her body, releasing the pressure that had been building for months. My name is Janelle Riggins, she wrote, the words flowing haltingly at first, then gaining momentum, each syllable a small act of defiance against the silence that had held her captive for so long. She wrote about the protest, about the surging crowd, about the fear that had pulsed in her veins as the police began to make arrests. She wrote about the absurdity of the makeshift courtroom, the kangaroo court presided over by a man drunk on power. She wrote about Mallaloy, the way he looked at her, not with anger or even hatred, but with a chilling indifference that cut deeper than any blade. She recounted every word, every gesture, every nuance of that horrific encounter. The way he smirked as he ordered her to be shaved. The way he held her head steady, his grip unyielding, while the clippers buzzed relentlessly. The way the hair fell, soft and weightless, onto the dusty floor. She wrote about the humiliation, the burning shame that seared her soul, the feeling of being stripped bare, not just of her hair, but of her dignity, her humanity. She wrote about the tears that wouldn't come, the choked sob trapped in her throat, the silent scream that echoed in the desolate landscape of her heart. Hours melted away, unnoticed. The hum of the refrigerator faded into the background, replaced by the rhythmic scratching of her pen against the paper. The small pool of lamplight seemed to shrink, drawing her deeper into the world of her memories. She wrote about the aftermath, the whispers and stares that followed her everywhere she went, the way people looked at her with a mixture of pity and disgust. She wrote about the sleepless nights, the recurring nightmares, the constant fear that gnawed at her insides. She wrote about the anger, the simmering rage that threatened to consume her, the desire for revenge that whispered insidious promises in her ear. She wrote and wrote, until her hand cramped and her eyes burned. She wrote until the ink ran dry and she had to rummage through her desk drawer for another pen. She wrote until the first rays of dawn crept through the blinds, painting the room in a soft, ethereal glow. Finally, she stopped, her hand hovering over the last sentence, the weight of her story settling upon her like a physical burden. 19 pages. 19 pages filled with the raw, unfiltered truth of her experience. 19 pages that bore witness to her pain, her humiliation, her resilience. 19 pages of truth, she whispered, her voice hoarse. The words hung in the air, heavy with significance. It wasn't a beautiful story. It wasn't a story she wanted to tell. But it was her story. And by writing it down, by claiming ownership of her narrative, she had taken the first step towards healing. The shame still lingered, a phantom limb that ached with its absence. But now, alongside the shame, something else began to stir. A flicker of defiance, a spark of hope, a nascent sense of agency. The act of writing had not erased the trauma, but it had transformed it. It had given her a voice, a weapon against the silence that had threatened to swallow her whole. It was a beginning. The fluorescent lights of courtroom hummed a monotonous tune, a stark contrast to the turbulent emotions swirling beneath the composed facade of Judge Janelle Riggins. The polished oak of her desk felt cool beneath her fingertips, a grounding sensation against the memories that threatened to breach the dam of her composure. 10 years. A decade had passed since that scorching summer day, yet the phantom weight of shaved hair still lingered, a constant reminder of the humiliation she had endured. She watched as the bailiff escorted a young man, Malik Harmon, to the witness stand. His nervousness was palpable, radiating in the tremor of his hands as he swore to tell the truth. Janelle recognized that fear, the almost suffocating awareness of being under scrutiny, of having your voice matter more than it ever had before. She took a measured breath, reminding herself of her role, her duty. This was not about her. This was about justice. Malik's eyes darted around the courtroom, settling briefly on Brent Mallaloy. The officer sat rigidly at the defendant's table, his gaze unwavering. Yet Janelle noticed a flicker of something in his eyes, not quite fear, but perhaps unease. "Mr. Harmon," she began, her voice steady and clear, "please tell the court what happened on the night of July 12, 2023. She focused on the young man, willing him strength with her gaze. Malik swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously. "I was driving home from work," he started, his voice barely above a whisper. "It was late, but I wasn't speeding. I swear." He glanced again at Mallaloy, a quick, furtive look. Janelle saw the internal battle raging within the boy, the struggle between fear and the burning need to speak his truth. "Officer Mallaloy pulled me over," Malik continued, his voice gaining a fraction of confidence. "He said my car looked too nice for a kid like me." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Janelle's stomach clenched. The same condescending tone, the same thinly veiled prejudice she remembered so vividly. Too nice for a kid like you. The echoes of her own experience reverberated within her, a bitter taste rising in her throat. She pressed her lips together, schooling her expression. Impartiality, objectivity, these were her anchors. "He asked if I had drugs." Malik's voice wavered. "I said no. I don't do drugs." He didn't believe me. He searched my car, tore it apart really. Then, when he was done, when he found nothing, he paused, his breath catching in his throat. He slammed the car door on my leg. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Mallaloy shifted in his seat, his jaw tightening. Janelle felt a surge of something cold and hard in her chest. Anger? No, it was something else, something deeper. A profound sense of weariness. The realization that even after 10 years, some things hadn't changed. She forced herself to maintain eye contact with Malik, offering a silent reassurance. "Thank you, Mr. Harmon," she said, her voice controlled. "Does the defense counsel have any questions?" Mallaloy's lawyer, a sharp-dressed woman with an air of practiced indifference, rose to her feet. Janelle watched her approach the witness stand, the rhythmic click of her heels echoing in the sudden silence of the courtroom. A familiar knot of tension tightened in Janelle's stomach. She knew what was coming. The subtle undermining of credibility, the insinuation of wrongdoing on the part of the victim. She'd seen it countless times. After a grueling cross-examination, Malik was dismissed. He walked back to his seat, his shoulders slumped, his face pale. Janelle felt a pang of empathy. She knew that even though he had spoken his truth, the experience had taken its toll. The bailiff then called Sandra Wells, a middle-aged woman with a quiet dignity that radiated even in the intimidating atmosphere of the courtroom. As Ms. Wells recounted her experience of fabricated traffic violation, a humiliating search, a confiscated driver's license, Janelle observed Mallaloy. His initial arrogance seemed to be slowly eroding, replaced by a grim, almost haunted look. He kept glancing at the clock on the wall, a nervous tick that Janelle found strangely satisfying. Time, she thought, catches up to all of us. Sandra's testimony echoed Malik's, painting a picture of a pattern of abuse, a blatant disregard for the rights of those he swore to protect. With each recounted incident, the weight of evidence against Mallaloy grew heavier, more damning. The courtroom air thickened with tension, the silence punctuated only by the quiet sobs of Sandra Wells as she recalled the humiliation she had endured. Janelle watched the jury, their faces grim, their expressions reflecting the gravity of the testimonies they had heard. She knew that this case, this moment, was about more than just one officer. It was about accountability, about the fragile trust between those who enforce the law and those who live under it. It was about ensuring that what had happened to her, to Malik, to Sandra, would not happen again. As the day's proceedings drew to a close, a profound sense of weariness settled over Janelle, but beneath it, a flicker of something else began to emerge. Not vengeance, not even satisfaction, but a quiet, unwavering hope. The hope that justice, however delayed, would ultimately prevail. The courtroom air, thick with anticipation, hung heavy with the scent of stale coffee and the faint metallic tang of fear. Janelle Riggins, her gaze fixed on the flickering screen, felt the weight of the moment press down on her, a palpable force settling in the hollow of her stomach. The grainy body cam footage, projected onto the wall, painted a stark tableau of the past, a past that still resonated with a dull ache within her. 10 years melted away, the ghostly chill of that November day seeping into the sterile warmth of courtroom 4B. On the screen, a younger, brasher Brent Mallaloy barked orders, his face contorted in a mask of self-righteous fury. The camera jostled, capturing glimpses of the chaotic protest, the shouts and pleas of the crowd reduced to distorted echoes. Janelle watched, her breath caught in her throat, as the lens focused on a young woman with fiery red hair, her eyes wide with defiance. Herself, the memory, usually a tightly wound ball of shame and anger, now unfurled slowly, each layer revealing a new nuance of pain. "He thought he could break me," she thought, her fingers tightening around the gavel. "He thought he could silence me." The video played on, the digital ghost of Mallaloy's past self looming large in the courtroom. He sneered, his words dripping with contempt as he manhandled the protesters, his actions escalating from forceful restraint to outright brutality. The courtroom was silent, save for the whir of the projector and the occasional choked sob from the gallery. Janelle observed the jury, their faces a mixture of disgust and disbelief. Even Mallaloy, seated at the defendant's table, seemed to shrink under the weight of his past actions. His face, now etched with lines of weariness and regret, was a stark contrast to the arrogant smirk captured on the screen. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his gaze darting between the judge and the damning footage. Does he feel it now? Janelle wondered, her thoughts a swirling vortex of conflicting emotions. The humiliation, the powerlessness. Does he finally understand? A flicker of something akin to satisfaction, sharp and fleeting, pierced through her carefully constructed composure. She pushed it down, reminding herself of the impartiality demanded by her position. Justice, not revenge, was her objective. Mallaloy's attorney, a seasoned lawyer named Ms. Caldwell, rose to her feet, her voice crisp and professional, attempting to salvage what little remained of her client's defense. "Your Honor," she began, her tone laced with carefully measured concern. "The footage, while disturbing, must be viewed within the context of the time. The protests were escalating, tensions were high, and Officer Mallaloy was acting under extreme pressure." Janelle listened impassively, her expression betraying nothing of the turmoil within. Extreme pressure? The thought echoed in her mind, laced with bitter irony. What about the pressure of having your head shaved in front of a jeering crowd? What about the pressure of carrying that shame for a decade? Mallaloy, taking a cue from his lawyer, spoke, his voice low and tinged with a newly acquired humility. "Your Honor," he said, his gaze fixed on a point somewhere beyond the judge's bench. I made mistakes. I was young, inexperienced. I let the situation get the better of me." He paused, swallowing hard. "I regret my actions that day. I truly do." Janelle studied him, searching for a flicker of genuine remorse beneath the carefully crafted performance. The courtroom held its breath, the silence punctuated only by the rhythmic ticking of the clock on the wall. The air crackled with unspoken tension, a silent battle waged between the past and the present. The footage, still looping on the screen, served as a stark reminder of the events that had brought them all to this point. Janelle's internal monologue was a tempest. Is it genuine? Is it just a desperate attempt to save his career? Her own experience whispered warnings, urging her to be wary of crocodile tears. Years of navigating. The legal system had taught her the art of discerning truth from carefully constructed facades. She drew a slow, steadying breath, the rhythmic exhale a conscious effort to regain control. "Officer Mallaloy," she began, her voice calm and measured, each word imbued with the weight of her position. "Your expressions of regret, while appreciated, do not erase the undeniable evidence presented before this court. The body cam footage clearly depicts a pattern of abusive behavior, a blatant disregard for the rights of those you were sworn to protect." Her gaze, sharp and unwavering, met his. "Furthermore," she continued, her voice gaining strength, "the testimonies of Mr. Harmon and Ms. Wells corroborate the footage, painting a disturbing picture of systemic misconduct." She paused, allowing her words to resonate in the hushed courtroom. Mallaloy's face, pale and drawn, was a canvas of defeat. Miss Caldwell, her composure finally cracking, opened her mouth to speak, but Janelle raised a hand, silencing her. "Based on the overwhelming evidence presented," she declared, her voice ringing with authority, "this court finds sufficient grounds for immediate termination of Officer Brent Mallaloy's employment with the City Police Department." A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Mallaloy's shoulders slumped, his gaze falling to the floor. "Furthermore," Janelle continued, her voice unwavering, "this court will be referring this case to the appropriate authorities for investigation of potential civil rights violations." The finality of her words hung in the air, heavy and inescapable. The gavel fell, its sharp crack echoing the shattering of Mallaloy's career, his reputation, his carefully constructed defense. Janelle, her gaze fixed on the now blank screen, felt a wave of exhaustion wash over her. The fight was over. Justice, long delayed, had finally been served. She rose, her back straight, her head held high, and exited the courtroom, leaving behind the ghost of the past and stepping into the light of a new day. The gavel fell, a sharp, decisive crack that echoed through the silent courtroom. The sound reverberated not just through the room, but through Janelle's very being, a tremor that resonated with a decade of held breath. A strange calm settled over her, a stillness that felt both familiar and foreign. She watched as Brent Mallaloy's face crumpled, the bravado he'd clung to throughout the trial finally shattering. His shoulders slumped, his gaze fixed on the polished wood of the defense table, as though seeking answers in its inanimate surface. Justice, she thought, the word forming silently in her mind, not revenge. Yet, the satisfaction that rippled through her was undeniable, a complex cocktail of triumph and melancholic closure. The courtroom remained hushed, the air thick with unspoken words, with the weight of the verdict. Janelle's fingers, interlaced on the polished surface of the bench, felt cold against the smooth wood. 10 years. 10 years since she had sat in this very courtroom, not as a judge, but as a young woman stripped of her dignity, her voice silenced. The memory, a vivid scar on her soul, resurfaced with the immediacy of a fresh wound. The courtroom, once a symbol of her humiliation, now became the stage for her vindication. It wasn't lost on her, the irony, the cyclical nature of life that had brought her back to this place. But on the other side of the bench, she cleared her throat, the small sound amplified in the quiet room. Heads turned towards her, expectant. Mallaloy's lawyer shifted uneasily, his gaze darting between his client and the judge. The jury, dismissed from their duty, lingered near the exit, their faces etched with a mixture of relief and something akin to awe. Janelle met their gazes, a silent acknowledgement of their role in this momentous occasion. Then, her voice, steady and clear, cut through the silence. "Before we adjourn," she began, her voice resonating with a newfound authority, "I have something I need to say." Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the carefully constructed wall of composure she had built around herself. She could feel the weight of the room, the weight of the past, pressing down on her. But her voice didn't waver. "When I was 19 years old," she continued, her gaze sweeping across the room, "I sat in this very courthouse. Not in this seat," she gestured towards her elevated position, "but down there." Her hand indicated the area where the public sat. She paused, the silence stretching, thick and heavy, allowing her words to sink in. The memory of that day, raw and visceral, flooded her senses, the harsh glare of the fluorescent lights, the metallic tang of fear in the air, the suffocating feeling of helplessness. She could almost feel the phantom weight of hands on her, the cold steel of the clippers against her scalp. "I wasn't a threat," she said, her voice laced with a quiet intensity that commanded attention. "I was just present, and that was enough to be punished." The words hung in the air, stark and unflinching. Her internal monologue raged. Was it enough? Was simply being present, voicing dissent, enough to justify such a brutal act? She swallowed, pushing down the surge of emotion that threatened to overwhelm her. "This bench," she continued, her voice gaining strength, "isn't about revenge. It's about responsibility." She looked directly at Mallaloy, her gaze unwavering. His face was ashen, his eyes devoid of the arrogance that had characterized him throughout the trial. In their place, she saw something else, a flicker of fear, perhaps even regret. It was a fleeting glimpse, quickly masked, but it was there. "Silence," Janelle declared, her voice rising in volume, "protects wrongdoers. It allows injustice to fester and grow." Her gaze swept across the room again, encompassing the lawyers, the journalists, the lingering jury members, and even the empty public gallery. "For 10 years, I carried the weight of that silence. The silence of fear, the silence of shame." Her voice softened slightly, tinged with a vulnerability that resonated with the raw honesty of her words. She drew a deep breath, steadying herself. But silence can also be a source of strength. It can be the quiet before the storm, the gathering of forces before the inevitable break. She looked down at her hands, the hands that had once trembled with fear, now steady and resolute. Today, that silence is broken. A collective intake of breath rippled through the courtroom. Janelle lifted her head, her gaze firm and unwavering. She saw Malik Harmon, the young witness who had bravely testified, standing near the back of the room. His eyes met hers, and she saw a glimmer of hope in his youthful face. Beside him stood Sandra Wells, her dignified posture radiating strength and resilience. Janelle offered them a small, almost imperceptible nod, a silent acknowledgement of their shared experience, their shared victory. The law, she continued, her voice resonating with conviction, is not a tool for oppression, but a shield for the vulnerable. It is a promise of justice, a testament to the belief that truth will ultimately prevail. She paused, allowing the weight of her words to settle upon the room. Today, she concluded, her voice ringing with finality, that promise has been kept. She looked once more at Mallaloy, his face a mask of defeat. The silence in the courtroom was profound, broken only by the quiet rustle of papers and the hushed whispers of departing spectators. Janelle rose from her seat, the weight of the gavel, the weight of the past, no longer a burden, but a symbol of the strength she had found within herself, within the very silence that had once threatened to consume her. She walked towards her chambers, leaving behind the echoes of her words, the echoes of a decade of silence finally broken. The courtroom, bathed in the soft glow of the afternoon sun, felt different now, cleansed, renewed. The air, once thick with tension and unspoken truths, felt lighter, freer. Justice, she realized, wasn't just about punishment. It was about healing, about finding one's voice amidst the silence. And today she had found hers. The heavy oak doors of the courthouse exhaled a stream of people, a collective breath released into the crisp autumn air. Janelle Riggins paused on the top step, the cool granite a stark contrast to the lingering heat of the courtroom. The setting sun cast long shadows, painting the cityscape in hues of orange and violet. She felt a tremor run through her, a subtle vibration of exhaustion and relief, the weight she hadn't realized she'd been carrying for a decade. A leaden cloak woven from humiliation and anger seemed to finally loosen its grip. It's over, she thought, the words a quiet echo in the vast chamber of her mind. It's finally over. But a part of her, a small, persistent voice, whispered back, is it really? Justice had been served, the scales balanced. Yet, a residue remained, a faint but persistent ache. The memory of that day, the raw, visceral shame, was a scar etched deep beneath the surface. Brent Mallaloy emerged from the courthouse, his face ashen, his gait unsteady. The arrogance that had clung to him like a second skin during the initial days of the hearing was gone, replaced by a stark vulnerability. The world seemed to tilt beneath his feet, the familiar solidity of his career, his life, crumbling into dust. He hadn't anticipated the young boy's testimony, the quiet dignity of the middle-aged woman's words. Each syllable had chipped away at his carefully constructed defenses, exposing the raw, ugly truth of his actions. I didn't mean for it to go this far, he thought, the justification a weak, pathetic whisper in the face of the verdict. He could feel the stares of his colleagues, the whispers that followed him like shadows. The shame was a physical sensation, a suffocating pressure in his chest. It wasn't the loss of his position that truly broke him. It was the shattering of the image he held of himself, the realization of the man he had become. Malik Harmon stood with his mother, a hand clasped tightly in hers. He'd been terrified to testify, the memory of that day a dark cloud hovering over him. But as he spoke, as he recounted his experience, a strange sense of empowerment began to blossom within him. He saw the judge, her gaze steady, her demeanor unwavering, and he felt a surge of hope. Maybe things can change, he thought, the idea taking root in the fertile ground of his youthful idealism. He looked at his mother, her eyes shining with pride and unshed tears, and he knew he had done the right thing. Sandra Wells stood a little apart, her shoulders squared, her chin held high. The hearing had been an ordeal, dredging up painful memories she had tried to bury deep within her. But it was also a liberation. Speaking her truth, facing her abuser, had been a cathartic act, a reclaiming of her own narrative. She felt a quiet strength settle within her, a newfound resilience forged in the crucible of her experience. It's not just for me, she thought, her gaze sweeping across the faces of the people gathered outside the courthouse. It's for everyone who has ever been silenced, for everyone who has ever been afraid to speak. A small group of students lingered on the courthouse steps, their faces etched with a mixture of awe and contemplation. They had been observing the proceedings as part of a civics class, a real-world lesson in the workings of the justice system. One of them, a young woman with bright, inquisitive eyes, turned to her friend, her voice hushed with reverence. "That's what justice is supposed to look like," she whispered, her words hanging in the air. Her friend, a young man with a thoughtful expression, nodded slowly. "That's what it feels like," he replied, his gaze fixed on the retreating figure of Judge Riggins. He thought about the power of her silence, the strength in her restraint. She hadn't used her position to exact revenge, to settle a personal score. Instead, she had wielded the law with impartiality, with unwavering integrity. It was a lesson that transcended the confines of the courtroom, a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit. The sun dipped, below the horizon, casting long shadows that stretched and distorted across the plaza. The air grew colder, a tangible shift from the warmth of the day. As the crowd dispersed, a sense of quietude settled over the scene, a palpable stillness that resonated with the weight of what had transpired. It was in these moments, in the aftermath of the storm, that true strength revealed itself. Not in the wielding of power, not in the clamor of retribution, but in the quiet dignity of resilience, in the unwavering pursuit of justice. The echoes of the day's events reverberated through the empty square, a silent testament to the transformative power of courage and the enduring hope for a better tomorrow.